People like stories. We like them so much, every few decades we wander back into the forest, dust off an old outlaw in green, and tell his story all over again. Robin Hood has never been one fixed person. He's a medieval waylayer in rough old ballads, a romantic rogue in Elizabethan plays, a swashbuckler in Technicolor, a weary old knight, a prince of thieves, and sometimes a punchline in tights. Every generation looks at this figure and quietly decides what it needs him to be. Back in 2010, when Ridley Scott and Russell Crowe took their turn with the legend, I talked about Robin Hood as a living canon, not a single true version we were all trying to rediscover, but an ongoing conversation that stretches from fireside stories and yellowed manuscripts all the way to the multiplex, as long as the storytellers kept adding something to that conversation. I was happy to welcome another Robin into the fold. Now we arrive at 2026 and the death of Robin Hood. The title alone tells you this isn't a usual origin or a greatest hits tour through Sherwood. This film doesn't try to erase the earlier versions or correct them. Instead, it walks into the forest much later when the songs have already been sung and the legend is old, wounded, and out of breath. And it quietly asks, what does it mean to be Robin Hood when the story is almost over? And what if Robin Hood wasn't the hero we've been told about for centuries? What if the stories got bigger than the man himself? The death of Robin Hood isn't interested in another adventure through Sherwood Forest. Instead, it asks what happens when a legend survives long enough to bury the truth. And honestly, that's what I found most interesting about this film. This video is going to stay spoiler-free. I'm going to talk about the mood, the ideas, and why this film feels like another valid chapter in a long tradition of Robin Hood tales. Later, I'll come back with a deeper breakdown that dives into specific scenes and choices and how this version talks to all the others you may already love. I'm Rob, and welcome back to A Constantly Racing Mind, where every frame tells a story. If you're into sci-fi, horror, action-adventure, pop culture, and all things geek, you're in the right place. If you enjoy this review, consider hitting the like button and subscribing. It really helps the channel. Also, I wanted to announce that this channel finally reached 1,000 subscribers, and I want to thank all of you who have subscribed or will be subscribing. Thank you. Now let's talk about the death of Robin Hood. Just an FYI, when the credits starts, you have officially seen the whole movie. So pick up your stuff, don't make a mess, and leave. The crew needs to clean up. The first thing to understand is that the death of Robin Hood is not a quippy action romp built around daring raids and clever disguises. It's a quieter, more intimate story that spends most of its time with an older Robin who has already lived the life the ballads like to celebrate. The battles, the robberies, the defiance of corrupt power. Those are mostly in the past. What the film is interested in now is the weight of all those choices on one man's body and conscience. Instead of rallying a band of merry men toward the next target, this Robin is struggling with his simple act of surviving his last fight. The forest is still there, power and injustice are still there, but we're seeing them through the eye of someone who has carried a bow and a cause for so long that his legend is more burden than costume. It's less about how he becomes Robin Hood and more about what it costs to have been Robin Hood for a lifetime. Tonally, the film leans into that perspective. The pace is measured with long stretches that sit in silence, pain, and reflection. Rather than rushing to the next set piece, the imagery is earthy and grounded. Mud, wood, blood, and worn faces instead of romanticized pageantry. When violence does happen, it feels heavy rather than triumphant. This is a Robin Hood movie that remembers every arrow has to land somewhere. And that someone has to live with that. Without getting into plot specifics, there are three big thematic strands that stood out to me. The first is regret and responsibility. Earlier versions of Robin Hood often treat the steal from the rich, give to the poor formula as an uncomplicated good. Here the film sits with the less tidy parts of that fantasy. The people hurt along the way, the moral shortcuts that get taken in the name of justice, and the question of whether noble intentions excuse a lifetime of violence. This Robin is not a symbol arguing philosophy. He's an aging fighter trying to decide how much of his own story he can stand to own. The second is the tension between stories and memory. The legend of Robin Hood is clean and exciting. The memories that surface here are jagged and incomplete. The film keeps nudging at the gap between the simple narrative we all like to tell, hero, villain, forest, arrow, and the messy reality that would sit behind a true outlaw's life. It's very aware that people like stories, but it's also interested in what those stories leave out. The third is legacy. Most modern Robin Hood movies ask some version of, how does he rise? This one quietly asks, what does he leave behind? Is Robin Hood a man, a cause, a myth, or just a trail of consequences other people have to live with? The film doesn't hammer you with answers, but it frames almost everything through that end-of-the-road perspective. You're not watching the legend to be born. You're watching it wrestle with itself. From a performance standpoint, the lead sells the internal conflict with a mix of physical exhaustion and stubborn defiance. The body is failing, but the will that made him a legend keeps trying to assert itself, sometimes to his own detriment. Opposite him, the caretaker character is more than a nurse. She functions as a kind of moral and emotional mirror, someone who listens, challenges, and forces this Robin to confront how his story looks from the outside. Their scenes together give the movie its spine. What really sold this film for me were the performances. I think the cast earns every minute the film spends developing these characters. Hugh Jackman is Hugh Jackman. You know him, Wolverine, The Greatest Showman, and Les Mis. But lately he's been gravitating toward older, morally complicated characters, and this feels like a natural extension of where his career is now. His Robin is lived in, not performative. You can see the weight of a lifetime in his posture and hear it in the way he fights his own legend. Other than Logan, this may be his best work, and I mean that as someone who thinks Logan is one of the best comic book movies ever made. Jodie Comer, Killing Eve, The Bike Riders, The Last Duel, brings grace, intelligence, and a much-needed soft touch to a harsh world. She quietly becomes the emotional center of the film without ever feeling sentimental. If Jackman is the wounded animal, she's the person who decides whether to help it or put it down. Bill Skarsgård, Pennywise, Count Orlok, and Murray Bartlett, The White Lotus, The Last of Us, are almost unrecognizable at first glance. Skarsgård's Little John fully bought into the romanticized Kool-Aid of the Robin Hood myth, which is why he's the only character in the film who wears the classic green. Bartlett plays a leper at the Priory, and his character locks in a different facet of who Robin has been and who he's allowed himself to become. They're both flamboyant in the best way, distinct, textured, very memorable. And then there's Faith Delaney. You probably don't know her name yet. She's a young Irish performer who plays Little Margaret. She has a much smaller role than the leads, but I'll tell you right now, she's emotionally anchors Jackman's character in the story. Keep an eye on her name. The whole look of the film worked for me. The cinematography and the visual design create a world that feels more like a 13th century England than the most Robin Hood adaptations ever dared to. There's a distinctive, almost gothic aesthetic that avoids the romantic storybook look and instead leans into something colder, rougher, and older. Credit here goes to Michael Sarnoski and cinematographer Pat Scola. Sarnoski's is the most important name in the production. Before Robin Hood, Sarnoski directed Pig, A Quiet Place, Day One, and what makes him interesting is that he consistently uses genre stories to explore grief, identity, memory, and regret. Pig looked like a revenge movie, but it wasn't. A Quiet Place, Day One, looked like an alien invasion movie, but was really about mortality. The death of Robin Hood looks like a medieval adventure, but is actually about myth, guilt, and legacy. That's very much his storytelling DNA. The expansive, bleak landscapes and the harsh Irish countryside don't just look pretty. They mirror the emotional states of the characters. You feel the isolation, the fatigue, the sense that the legend has been worn down by the land and history itself. The production design and costumes deepen the old world vibe. Everything looks lived in, used, and fraying at the edges rather than fresh off a costume rack. Pat Scola, the cinematographer, his previous credits include Pig, Sing Sing, and A Quiet Place, Day One. Pat Scola has become Sarnoski's primary visual collaborator for Robin Hood. They shot on 35mm film, giving the movie a rough, textured appearance that feels more historical and less digitally polished. The film doesn't look like a fantasy. It looks like history remembered through folklore. The editing was left up to the capable hands of Andrew Monshine. Monshine is a veteran editor whose resume stretches back decades. Some of his major credits include The Sixth Sense, Unbreakable, The Devil Wears Prada, and many other films over the decades. His strength is character-driven pacing rather than rapid-fire cutting, and that fits perfectly with Robin Hood's contemplative structure. I also appreciated Jim Geddes' musical score. There's an earth-real folk quality to the music that fits the film's melancholic tone and wide, desolate visuals. It doesn't sound like a big, triumphant adventure score. It sounds like something that could have drifted in from before the Renaissance, before Chaucer, from the hazy space where rumors and ballads were just starting to form. This is one of the most interesting hires for the film. Geddes comes primarily from the British folk music scene rather than the blockbuster film scoring. His music often combines traditional English folk influence, acoustic instrumentation, dark atmosphere textures, and minimalist arrangements. And that approach makes perfect sense for a Robin Hood story focused on a folklore rather than the adventure. The music helps place this story in that liminal zone between history and myth. It supports the quieter, meditative second half just as effectively as it underlies the shock and violence of the opening. Speaking of that opening, walking into the film's first act was a jolt, in a good way. The violence is vivid, visceral, and generally unsettling. It feels physical and ugly rather than stylized or fun, and that very quickly strips away the romanticism that a lot of 20th and 21st century Robin Hood films have layered into the myth. Instead of heroic action beats, you get the sense of what that kind of life would really do to a human body. For me, that set the tone beautifully. It tells you up front that it's not a movie interested in glorifying the outlaw fantasy. It's going to sit with the cost. On the other hand, I know some people are going to struggle with the pacing and the structure, especially in the second half. Personally, I'm not in the camp that found the second half boring. The title of the film told me exactly what kind of story I was walking into, and I understood why the tone shifts. It actually reminded me a bit of The Last Samurai in the way it moves from large-scale violence into something more introspective and elegiac. That said, I completely get why viewers who don't know the Robin Hood canon or who are coming in expecting a more conventional adventure movie might bounce off. The slow, meditative pacing can feel like a nasty, unpleasant grind if you're waiting for the next action sequence or the film to turn into a romance. Even for me, I'll admit that the loss of momentum in the second half becomes a bit tedious in spots. There are stretches that come in waves. You feel your attention starting to drift. Then the film pulls you back in. I was still engaged overall, but it's not a tight, propulsive narrative. If you're looking for action, some humor, or a sweeping love story like a certain earlier versions, you'll probably be disappointed. This film is not built to scratch that itch. The tonal whiplash is real. The abrupt transition from a hyper-violent, action-heavy opening to a quiet, dialogue-sparse character study is going to shock anyone who isn't prepared for it. Consider this your warning. Where the marketing might not give you one, this is the deathbed introspection movie wearing an outlaw's costume, not a romp through Sherwood. Look, I have to be honest about this one. My wife leaned over about 20 minutes in and whispered, "I have no idea what these people are saying." She wasn't wrong. It's not the accents themselves exactly. It's that Sarnoski has clearly gone for the full naturalistic immersion. These characters mumble, they talk under their breath, the wind whips around them, the fire crackles, and sometimes the dialogue just gets swallowed up by the environment. It feels authentic as hell. This world is cold and damp and miserable, and people wouldn't project like they are on stage. But authentic doesn't always mean audible. I caught most of it. She caught maybe 60%, and if you're someone who struggles with British or Irish accents in films, this one's going to test you. My practical advice: if your theater offers those closed caption devices for the hearing impaired, grab one. No shame in it. I've done it before and it saved a movie for me. Or cross your fingers for a streaming release with subtitles, because this one is one of those rare films that actually benefits from them. Back in 2010, my research into the Robin Hood canon led me deep enough that I was looking at hairstyles of the era, actually a bit earlier than the time frame this film is evoking. During King John's time, everyday hairstyles tended to be shorter, while nobility often wore their hair longer. In this film, Robin doesn't read as noble to me. He reads as an outlaw who has long since abandoned society's rules, including grooming. So, critically, The Death of Robin Hood has landed squarely in the your mileage may vary category. The film sits around at 68% on Rotten Tomatoes, with audiences coming in a bit lower at 59%. Metacritic is out at 60 out of 100, while IMDb users are rating it as 6.2 out of 10. Now, looking at these numbers, I think they make perfect sense. This is not a crowd-pleasing Robin Hood adventure. Michael Sarnoski has made a slow, reflective character drama about guilt, mortality, redemption, and the stories we tell about historical figures. Some critics really connected with that approach. Others found it overly bleak and deliberate. The audience response seems to reflect that same divide. At the box office, the film opened to just under $3 million domestically, with a worldwide total sitting just around $2.9 million as of this recording. Now, that's with a production budget of $20 million, and that's certainly not blockbuster territory. But this also feels like a film that was made for a very specific audience rather than the mass market crowd. I think some people are going to find the film's philosophical second half unearned or empty. I couldn't disagree more. The film asks the exact question that keeps bringing me back to this canon time and time again. Why do we tell these stories? Sarnoski presents a merciless, barbaric 13th century world and shows us that in a place that dark, people need legends to survive. We tell stories because we like them. They give us our life's meaning. They give us hope when there isn't much to hope for. Even little John, Robin's violent former companion, Sarnoski called him a murder baby, which I love completely, bought into the romanticized Kool-Aid of the Robin Hood myth. He's the only character in the film who wears the classic green because he still believes in the fairy tale. He is the fairy tale, walking around in costume while everyone else has moved on. Robin's redemption isn't found in a glorious final battle. He finds peace by breaking the cycle of violence, convincing a vengeful young survivor to go home and live his life instead of picking up the sword. In his final moments, he gives an orphan girl named Little Margaret the one thing the world actually needs: a story. He lies to her. He tells her the classic legend, that he and her father fought bad people to help the poor. He knows it's not true. The man was a monster. But the story of the hero, that's what carries us through. That's what keeps the darkness at bay. And honestly, that hit me harder than any arrow ever could. If I had to put a number on it, I'm a solid 4 out of 5. But it's one of those 4s that feels dangerous because the more I sit with this film, the images, the performance, the way it reframes the legend, the more I want to go back and see it again. I wasn't planning to review this one. I figured I'd just let it live in my head. But it kept nagging at me. It kept replaying certain moments, certain choices, and that's exactly why you're getting this video. Sometimes a 4 out of 5 is more interesting than a perfect score because it makes you wrestle with it. In this one, I'm still wrestling. Thanks for watching. Check out the channel merch, and for long movies, take the Run P app so you know when to sneak out and not miss anything. I'm Rob, and this has been A Constantly Racing Mind, and I'll see you in the next video. Take care.